September 25, 1396. On the banks of the Danube River, in what is now Bulgaria, tens of thousands of Europe's finest knights, French, Burgundian, German, Hungarian, Wallachian, stand ready for what many of them believe will be a glorious crusade. Within a few hours, most of them will be dead or captured. Within a few days, thousands of prisoners will be executed on the orders of the Ottoman Sultan. This was the last great crusade of the Middle Ages. And it collapsed in a single afternoon, because the most heavily armored men in Europe rode straight into a trap set by an enemy they underestimated. The man who set that trap was Sultan Bayezid I, nicknamed Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his campaigns. The men who walked into it included some of the greatest noble houses in France and Burgundy. Their commander was John of Nevers, eldest son of Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a young nobleman about to learn, in the worst possible way, the difference between chivalric glory and battlefield discipline. Here is the number almost nobody expects. Within a day of winning, Bayezid ordered several thousand captured European prisoners executed, sparing only the wealthiest nobles who could be ransomed. This is documented directly by a survivor, a young German soldier named Johann Schiltberger, who was captured that day and later wrote one of the most important eyewitness accounts of the battle and its aftermath. Before we go further, this video is built entirely from verifiable history, chronicles, eyewitness memoirs, and the work of modern historians of the Crusades and the Ottoman Empire. Nothing here is invented for drama. This is the Battle of Nicopolis, 1396. Stay with us. By the 1390s, the Ottoman Empire under Bayezid I had become the dominant power in the Balkans. His father, Murad I, had already broken Serbian resistance at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Bayezid continued the expansion, pushing Ottoman control deeper into southeastern Europe and placing direct pressure on the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, which by this point was nearly surrounded by Ottoman territory. King Sigismund of Hungary, whose kingdom bordered Ottoman territory directly, recognized the danger and called for help from the rest of Christian Europe. His appeal found a receiver in France and Burgundy, where the idea of a crusade against the Ottomans still carried real prestige. Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, sent a large contingent of French and Burgundian knights, commanded by his son, John of Nevers, still in his 20s, eager to prove himself in what chroniclers of the time openly described as an expedition driven partly by genuine faith and partly by a hunger for chivalric glory. The crusading army that gathered in 1396 was, on paper, formidable. It included Hungarian troops under Sigismund, Wallachian forces, French and Burgundian knights, German contingents, and even a detachment of the Knights Hospitaller. Contemporary estimates of the army's total size vary widely across chronicles and are treated with caution by modern historians, but it was, without question, one of the largest Western European military efforts assembled against the Ottomans in the medieval period. The Crusaders marched down the Danube, capturing several minor fortresses along the way, before laying siege to the fortress town of Nicopolis in September 1396. Bayezid, campaigning elsewhere in the region at the time, moved quickly to relieve the siege, marching his army north to confront the Crusaders directly. Before the battle, Sigismund, who understood Ottoman tactics far better than his Western allies, from years of border warfare, argued for a specific plan. Let the lighter Hungarian and Wallachian troops go first, to test and absorb the initial Ottoman lines, while the heavily armored Western knights held back as a decisive reserve. The French and Burgundian nobles rejected this. They considered the idea of anyone else claiming the glory of the first charge to be an insult to their own honor and rank. Over Sigismund's objections, the French and Burgundian knights insisted on leading the attack themselves. On September 25, 1396, the Crusader army advanced. The French and Burgundian heavy cavalry charged first. Exactly as they had demanded, what awaited them was not a disorganized enemy, but a carefully prepared defensive position. Bayezid had placed a screen of lighter, expendable troops and sharpened stakes in front of his main position, designed specifically to blunt and exhaust a heavy cavalry charge before his real strength was committed. The French knights broke through this first line, at heavy cost, and after a brutal, exhausting climb up rising ground under fire. But by the time they reached the top, their horses were spent, their formation was broken, and they were deep inside prepared enemy territory, far from support. That is when Bayezid committed his reserve, his elite Janissary infantry, and a force of heavy cavalry under Stefan Lazarevic, the Serbian prince, himself an Ottoman vassal following the outcome at Kosovo 7 years earlier. This fresh, disciplined force struck the exhausted, disorganized Crusader vanguard and shattered it. Sigismund's main Hungarian force, advancing behind the French charge, arrived too late to reverse the collapse and was overwhelmed in turn. The Crusader army disintegrated. Sigismund himself narrowly escaped. Overwhelmed in turn. The Crusader army disintegrated. Sigismund himself narrowly escaped, reportedly fleeing by boat down the Danube, eventually making his way to Constantinople and back to Hungary by sea, a humiliating retreat for the king who had organized the entire expedition. What followed the battle was as brutal as the fighting itself. Ottoman and Western sources both describe a mass execution of captured crusaders the day after the battle. Bayezid reportedly ordered this in direct retaliation for atrocities committed earlier in the campaign, when Crusader forces had killed a number of Ottoman prisoners and local Muslim inhabitants during their advance down the Danube, a documented tit-for-tat brutality typical of medieval warfare, not one-sided. Johann Schiltberger, the young German squire captured in the battle, later wrote that he personally witnessed the mass killing of prisoners, and was spared execution himself only because of his youth. He would go on to spend decades in captivity across the Ottoman and Timurid worlds before eventually returning home and publishing one of the most valuable surviving eyewitness accounts of the battle. John of Nevers, along with a small number of the wealthiest and highest-ranking nobles, was spared for ransom. The eventual ransom Burgundy paid to free him was enormous. Historians note it placed significant financial strain on the Duchy of Burgundy for years afterward. So, after all of that, what did Nicopolis actually achieve? For the Crusaders, essentially nothing. It was a catastrophic defeat that ended, for a generation, any serious Western European attempt to organize a large-scale crusade against the Ottomans. Historians generally regard Nicopolis as the last major crusade of the medieval era. For Bayezid, the victory looked, in the moment, like the final step toward finishing what his father had started, the conquest of Constantinople itself. In the years following Nicopolis, Bayezid tightened his siege of the Byzantine capital, and it appeared increasingly likely that the city would fall decades before it actually did in 1453. Here is the twist. It didn't fall, not yet. Because a far greater threat was approaching Bayezid from the east, the Central Asian conqueror Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Timur's forces crushed Bayezid's army and captured the Sultan himself. Bayezid died in captivity the following year, in 1403. The same Sultan who had annihilated the flower of European chivalry at Nicopolis, who had Constantinople within his grasp, was himself defeated and taken prisoner by another empire entirely, and Constantinople's fall was delayed by another 57 years, until Mehmed II finally took the city in 1453. That is the real lesson buried underneath the drama of Nicopolis. Europe's knights lost not because they lacked courage, but because individual glory-seeking overrode coordinated strategy, a lesson repeated in medieval battle after medieval battle. And the empire that destroyed them was, within 6 years, brought to its knees not by the men it had just crushed, but by an entirely different conqueror from a direction nobody at Nicopolis was watching. Two very different kinds of pride collided on that field in 1396, the pride of knights who wouldn't wait their turn, and the pride of a sultan who thought his empire's greatest danger came from the west. Both were wrong, and history remembered both mistakes. This has been the Battle of Nicopolis, 1396.